Man, what an introduction to follow. So much energy so early in the morning, right? Go Irene. Yeah, I really appreciate that you all are here and that you have such great support of the McNay. We're really happy to be partnering with the McNay because the Texas Fashion Collection is an incredible cache of pieces. So this is just one brief snapshot into our collection storage area. As Irene mentioned, we have nearly 20,000 historic and designer garments and accessories. For the most part, these are just stored in this cold, dark closet most of the time. So while the collection has this incredible wealth of resources, as far as our collection goes, we don't actually have a gallery space. So it's really important for us to partner with area cultural institutions like the McNay to make pieces in our collection available to people and more accessible. In fact, some of the pieces that are on view in this exhibition, this is the very first time that they're available for the public to see. So the work that we're doing, I think, is really important. People have donated these pieces to the collection with the understanding that they'll be used for people's enjoyment, for education, and for research. So I really appreciate that the McNay has created this opportunity for that. And also, I appreciate that you all are going to be stewards of our collection. In some ways, I feel like you all are also docents of the Texas Fashion Collection during the run of this exhibition. So with that, I really appreciate that you're advocating for the history of fashion and advocating for fashion as an art form. Because that's kind of a new idea. I believe this is the first fashion exhibition that's going to be at the McNay. So while you all have, I know, advocated for the theater arts and for costuming, as a fine art that should be appreciated, this is kind of like a landmark moment for this institution. So I'm glad we're all being part of it. With that in mind, I'm wondering, kind of to get a judge of the temperature of the room, how many of you all think fashion is the greatest thing in the world and you are so excited there's a fashion exhibition here and this is what you have waited every year of your life to have happen? Yeah? Oh, that's quite a few of you. That's kind of exciting. Okay, so many of you all, this will be a very, very easy sell. Okay, how many of you, like if you could just like put a pillowcase on every morning or a pair of jeans, you'd be happy and you maybe find this like a little bit intimidating, like this might be a lot of new content? Okay, I totally get that too. So with that said, I hope that through the run of this exhibition and through all this education that you'll be getting this week, that we remember that we're all part of a fashion system. So whether you are wearing an Yves Saint Laurent hat this morning or whether you have nothing but blue jeans in your wardrobe, none of us showed up here today with a bedsheet draped over us. Right? We all have a wardrobe and we all make decisions about how we dress every day. We have different clothing that we wear as pajamas, different clothing that we might wear for special events, and maybe something else that we wear for events like this. So even if we don't all consider ourselves to be, you know, the highest level of fashionista, I think we can all appreciate that fashion really relates a lot to who we are as individuals and how we use our clothing to project certain ideas about where we are and how we come together as communities. So I hope while this exhibition is up, you'll kind of keep that as an idea in the back of your head. Because I know some people will be wondering like what this has to do with them. And I think because everyone wears clothing, this has something to do with everyone, right? Are we on board with that idea? Everyone's super excited? Okay, so with all that said, I know that it can be kind of intimidating working with a new media or a new medium, especially in a museum when you all are expected to have some level of expertise. So I'm hoping today that we can talk a lot about what fashion is, what it was in the 1990s, and then as the title of my talk alludes, maybe we can talk about how some things were changing in the 1990s, some of the names that might be kind of storied and really well known, and then some of the new faces that were entering the world of fashion design in the 1990s. All of these figures have really made an impact on what fashion is today. So hopefully we can pull some threads through the 1990s through now so we can help make this a lot more relevant for our visitors. So I think a great place to start is thinking about haute couture, which is considered kind of the highest level of fashion. So on the handout that I prepared for you all, there's a little section on there, like you don't have to read it right now, but it's kind of something that could be a nice reminder for later. The word couture kind of gets thrown out all the time, like there's juicy couture sweatpants, you can buy couture pet snacks. But in the world of high fashion, haute couture has a very specific meaning. So it's a word that that we shouldn't use very often because it isn't applied to very many things. So the word haute couture is a protected name, kind of like champagne. So you can get sparkling wine from anywhere in the world, but if you want to call it champagne, it needs to come from a very specific region in France. So haute couture is kind of similar. There's a really small list of designers that have been couturiers because you kind of have to be approved by this council and be a member of it. You have to have an atelier or workshop in Paris that employs a certain number of people. You have to show at Paris Fashion Week with a certain number of looks twice a year. And usually pieces that are part of haute couture are hand-stitched for the most part. These are all custom made for one person's body. So these are a few examples of some couture pieces, and actually I think one of them is not a couture piece. So Oscar de la Renta is a designer who kind of bridges kind of like not couture fashion, so something that's often called ready to wear, and the world of haute couture. So Oscar de la Renta is an American fashion designer whose career started in the 1960s. So by the time we get to the 1990s, he has a lot of experience under his belt. The House of Balmain, which is spelled B-A-L-M-A-I-N, pronounced Balmain, that is a historic French house, and they were looking for a new person to run it. This is an haute couture house. And Oscar de la Renta was chosen to be the head of this couture house. This was a really big moment because the world of haute couture is really narrow and really elite, and a lot of French people are really protective of it. In the same way that we're kind of protective of Hollywood maybe, like our American identity is kind of set through Hollywood. It's something we all enjoy together. We watch the Oscars because we like to know who is the very best in the world of Hollywood. A lot of people in France really keep an eye on haute couture, and they really want it to be a French thing. So it was really an honor when in 1992, Oscar de la Renta was invited to be the head of the House of Balmain. So he was still creating pieces under his own label. I think the piece in the middle is under his own label, and then I think the other two are haute couture pieces that he made for the House of Balmain. Can we really tell a difference between what is haute couture and what Oscar de la Renta made under his own label? Honestly not. So the word haute couture, I think, really gets elevated to the point that it feels almost untouchable and sacred. But I think it's really important to remember that even designers who are working outside of that context are doing really incredible work. I wanted to call our attention to a figure who's really important in this exhibition. It was really important to Oscar de la Renta. So this is a photo of Mercedes Bass, who lives in Fort Worth. She's donated over 800 pieces to the Texas Fashion Collection. So if anyone is a high-level Gold Star fashionista, it would be Mercedes Bass. I think she also provided support for this exhibition happening, and I think there are around 15 ensembles that she donated that are on view in this show. So I think it's really important to remember that while Oscar de la Renta is an important figure in fashion, that often the people who are patrons of the fashion arts are really important too. So I wanted to call attention to that relationship. Mercedes Bass donated around 300 pieces by Oscar de la Renta. So if we think about the world of fine art, we often think of patronage and how important the relationship is between a collector and an artist or designer, and I think we can really see that here. What's really important too is that because all of the pieces she donated were custom made to her, we know that they were made at a really high level, that this is something that's really elevated and something we can celebrate as fashion as an art. I would encourage us to, when we're in the galleries, to try to look really closely at this. Of course, the gallery staff might try to push us away a little bit, so we have to be mindful of how close we get to the platforms. But something that really elevates a lot of high fashion is the textiles that are used. So if you get really close to this piece, you can see that there are these scallops, and each one of those is a strip of fabric that's been cut out and stitched together. So this is not a print. This is not a textile that was woven to look like that. If any of you all might be quilters, you know what it's like to put lots of small pieces together to make a larger textile. That's exactly what's happening here. So we have these white bands of fabric that are trimmed in satin ribbon, which are the lighter pieces, and then there are inserts of netting, which make sheer pieces that are much thinner. So this is a piece that really, I think, benefits from a lot of close looking. It's a really, really fine example of the textiles that are used in really high fashion pieces. Another designer who is working in the world of haute couture is Ralph Rucci. So this is an evening dress that kind of helps open the exhibition. You'll see it when you first walk into the gallery. Ralph Rucci is another American who was working in the world of haute couture in Paris during the 1990s. Have any of you all heard the name Ralph Rucci? No, some of you have maybe? Okay. He's someone who I think is far less known because unlike Oscar de la Renta, who is making a fair number of ready-to-wear pieces, so pieces that were produced on more of a mass scale that were available in department stores that came in preset sizes, so a lot of people had access to them. Ralph Rucci really considers himself to almost be a fine artist, and he wanted to have a hand in pretty much everything that he made. So this is another piece that really benefits from some close looking because we know that the artist really had a hand in it. Ralph Rucci is known for his really refined aesthetic. So many of the pieces he made fall under the title he gave them, which is called Chado, which is C-H-A-D-O. Are any of you all familiar with Japanese tea ceremonies? Maybe you have an idea of what they are. So they're really refined. There is nothing extra. There might be a lot of rules that we follow for the sake of tradition and really celebrating how elegant that can be. So Ralph Rucci using the word chado to describe his collections, I think gives us an idea about how he was thinking about the aesthetic he's developing. So if we look at this piece, you can see that this is almost sculptural. If you look really carefully, especially when you see it in person, you can see that there are seams that follow the back of that train to give it a very specific shape. And if we were able to kind of pull that skirt up, you'd be able to see a lot of structure underneath. They're almost like built-in undergarments to make sure this dress has this exact shape. He also has this draped cowl in the back. And if any of you all have worked with fabric and tried to make it behave exactly as you want it to, you know this is not an easy thing to accomplish. Many of the seam lines, so where two pieces of fabric are joined together to make fabric go from a two-dimensional form to a three-dimensional form, many of those lines, the seams, have top stitching following them. So often if we look at our clothing, the seams are supposed to kind of just disappear, so we look at the shape of a garment. But with Ralph Rucci's pieces, he really wants us to pay attention how we put everything together. So this is a piece, if you have people who are really interested in construction, it's really wonderful to be able to point out how this thing is actually created, that you can notice all of those seams that bring pattern pieces together. While a lot of this high fashion was available to people through runway photos, if you read the fashion section of a local newspaper, or maybe subscribe to Vogue, not everyone is able to go to Paris and perhaps spend tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars on a single garment, right? Like, I know that is definitely not my experience of fashion. So there's a really interesting relationship between Paris as a place that kind of sets what styles are often, and then people who make them more accessible. Victor Costa is a Texas figure, so it's exciting to have a Texan designer represented in this exhibition. So he made two pieces. The one in the middle isn't included in the exhibition, but the two on the other ends are. Victor Costa worked in Dallas. He had a fashion manufacturing site there. So unlike Paris, where there's an atelier where individual seamstresses are doing a lot of hand stitching, in the United States, a lot of fashion is created through manufacturing. So there are bigger companies where people are making things kind of en masse. So that means that the cost of things is much lower, right? And you can create a lot more of them more quickly. Victor Costa is known as the king of the copycats. So that might give us a better understanding of what he was doing during this time period. So here we have a photo of a Versace piece from the Spring-Summer 1992 collection, and then we have a Victor Costa piece. It's really interesting to compare these two, right? Because the aesthetic is incredibly similar. Some of us might say this is kind of like cheating, it's copying, it's plagiarism. But what's really interesting is the world of fashion has always kind of leaned into this type of thing. So historically, a lot of American designers were kind of pushed into making copies of French fashions. That was happening in the late 1800s and early 1900s. It wasn't until the 1930s that anyone was really interested in buying pieces made by American designers. And we can see that even in the 1990s, we're still kind of looking to European designers for inspiration. So some people really loved buying Victor Costa's pieces and letting people know that they bought them from him because they were quite proud that they were not being frivolous and spending ludicrous amounts of money going to Paris and having things custom fit for them. But I think it's also important for us to remember that the origin of ideas ideas is really important, and that when we celebrate designers as artists, that I think it's really important that we value original thought and creativity. So I think some of these Victor Costa pieces might be an interesting point to maybe put some tension into thinking about what the world of fashion is. If it being so commercial is really important because it means it's an art that everyone can have in their lives, or if it means that sometimes things get stolen or copied or diluted so that more people have access. I think it's a point of tension to think about these things. And ideas about who gets to have access, I think kind of come into this too. Because often, a hefty bank account is what affords people access to high fashion, and often what makes people really uncomfortable with it because it feels like it's outside or often above them. So something to think about, our own relationships with that, that kind of tension, and maybe how we want to think about sharing it with some of our visitors or helping them think through that. So as we move back into the world of haute couture, we move to Hubert de Givenchy. How many of you all have heard of Givenchy? Oh, excellent. I'm so glad there are so many hands being raised. So Givenchy is a very storied couturier. He trained with Cristobal Balenciaga, who Christian Dior called the master of us all, to give you an idea of how important Balenciaga is. Hubert de Givenchy constantly looked to him for guidance and kind of kept his craft at a really high level for the decades that he ran his fashion company. So this is a really supreme example of Givenchy. This is from the late 1980s, so kind of leading into the 1990s. Givenchy had been designing for decades at this point. It was really known for his classic silhouettes. A good cultural touch point for people. Givenchy designed most of Audrey Hepburn's clothing for film. So especially maybe for some of our younger visitors who maybe haven't necessarily heard the name Givenchy or only know it as the crazy cycle of people that have been running it in the past few decades. I think Audrey Hepburn is an accessible fashion icon that many people have heard of. So you can see here that Givenchy really has a mastery of materials, that he uses this silk file, which is a really stiff fabric that has a lot of body, to create this really sculptural poof. It's almost like a bustle on the back. This is a strapless piece that kind of fits perfectly to the wearer's body. This is another piece that was donated by Mercedes Bass, so we know whose body it was fitted to. And what we can't see in this that's really a hallmark of haute couture is that this is fitted to a body and that it has a lot of structure on the inside. So we talked about that Ralph Rucci piece having almost like internal undergarments to create the shape of that train. This piece has almost like a corset on the inside that's built into the garment. So everything is kind of anchored to the wearer's body. That's a bit of information that sometimes we lose when things are put on mannequins or when they're on someone's body. You can't see all the craft that goes into creating something on the inside. So actually, now that I think of it, maybe I should send some photos to you all. I'll send them to Kate of the insides of some Givenchy pieces on the chance that you all might like to see them, on the chance that maybe some visitors might too. Because I think that's something that we can all appreciate in garments. Sometimes we have boning that pokes at our sides, or something that's giving a garment structure that you really can't appreciate until you see what's on the inside or you see how it's really put together. So Givenchy is kind of serving as a bridge into the 1990s, and I think he's kind of a transitional figure for us in this time period. So we can see that this is really an elevated silhouette, that there's something, almost timeless about this. If we didn't know it was from the late 80s, we might have a hard time placing it in an exact period. But the color and the fabric are kind of fun and playful, and there's something about that kind of roots us in a specific time period. So Givenchy retired in the 1990s, which created kind of a moment of panic for a lot of people because he was one of those couturiers, one of the last ones to open a fashion house in the 1960s. Another fashion house after Yves Saint Laurent in the early 70s. Another fashion house, another haute couture house wasn't opened until the late 80s with Christian Lacroix. So that means there aren't a lot of new faces coming into the world of haute couture. It's something that's kind of traditional and maybe a little conservative. So when Givenchy decides to retire, what happens? Like, does his company close, and then all the people who have worked for him, maybe for decades, lose their jobs? All of the customer base that the financial backers for this couture house have, what's going to happen to all of their money? Because, ultimately this is a business. There's kind of a moment of trying to figure out what's going to happen. So you all might know that Givenchy is still open. So obviously they decided to find some figures to continue its existence. So here we have an example of a Givenchy coat on the far side. This is, I think, one of the supreme examples of tailoring that came from him. You'll notice that there are some different patterns and kind of abstracted shapes that are on this. Each of those are kind of like quilt pieces. They're pattern pieces that have been inserted. So that's not surface design, that's the structure of the garment. It's really, really incredible. Another piece that's great to look at carefully. And then the kind of organic swirling motifs that come up from the bottom and across the chest of this piece. That's all hand embroidery that's been done, which is really incredible. Again, like, we can admire haute couture for being at the height of its craft. Then we have some pieces by Alexander McQueen, a character that I think many of us have heard of as kind of a young renegade who is interested in doing some pretty fashion-forward, pretty avant-garde things for the world of fashion. Here you can see an ensemble that he created. On the far end is the piece that's in our collection and that's on view in this exhibition, and in the middle is the runway photo from it. So I think in comparing the two garments, we can see that there's kind of classical tailoring. We can see what's called a Prince of Wales fabric that's iconic for the House of Givenchy. So you can see that similar fabric is used between the two pieces. So there's some continuity. There's almost like some brand DNA. There's something that Alexander McQueen is definitely paying attention to as being specifically Givenchy. But you can see that in the styling from the photo in the center, that there is something radically new and kind of edgy and maybe even a little bit scary for some people happening. Another thing I want to point out is that there are some stylistic differences between the photo in the middle and the one on the end, right? So what are some things that we might notice about how these are different? Yeah, so it might be shorter collar. So really overall, the piece in the middle looks a little more severe in its styling, right? All the lines are a little more exaggerated. The angles are a little bit sharper. Where things jut out, it's more extreme. So you'll notice that there's been some give and take here because the client on the end, Jerry Ann Costa, who is actually married to Victor Costa, our friend, the king of the copycats, we can see that Jerry Ann Costa worked with the House of Givenchy to make something that fit her lifestyle, that fit her. So while often we see runway photos of pieces and assume that the designer is king, that there is nothing that can flinch in their aesthetic vision for something, in the world of haute couture, a lot of designers often have a little give and take with their clientele because they are working with them one-on-one to make sure these pieces fit them exactly. Some designers refuse to budge, but I think it says something about the House of Givenchy that they want to make sure that people are happy with their pieces and that there's something they'll actually wear. And for what it's worth, there aren't actually all that many people who actually buy haute couture pieces. So some couture houses have as few as 24 clients a year buying things. So how many of us have seen photos from Parisian runways, Paris Fashion Week? Probably most of us. How many people are actually getting to wear those things? Like this many. Right? And I think that's something not a lot of people know. It might be an important thing to share with some visitors because haute couture has this kind of like outsized place in our cultural understanding of what high fashion is. But a lot of these fashion houses end up making most of their money through handbags and perfumes, and then a lot of ready-to-wear lines that are more accessibly priced versions of pieces. So I think this is a really great example of a lot of things that are happening in the world of fashion that maybe we don't get to see all the time. Is there a question?
What would a client pay for a one-off piece like this?
So the question is, what would a client pay for a one-off piece like this? It's my understanding that ensembles start at around $10,000 or $20,000 for one simple dress or one simple suit. And that's really just the beginning. So on top of that, you can start adding things like specialty textiles that might be created just for that fashion house. You might employ embroiderers like the House of Lesage to then add some surface decoration to pieces, surface design. So maybe doing some of the embroidery on this photo here. So it really just goes up from there. And I think it's really easy for some of us to think like, why in the world would someone spend tens of thousands of dollars on a garment that's just as good as the one that I'm wearing right now? And I think it's really important to maybe put this in the context of fine art, and that sometimes a poster will do the job. Sometimes we want something beautiful to look at, but sometimes we really want to support a system that really supports creativity and originality and new production that's pushing a media or an art form further, right? So if we think about a place like the McNay, many of us might want to have a poster of one of the pieces in the collection in our home. We might enjoy a postcard, but we understand that that doesn't have the same value as an original artwork and supporting an artist. So many people who support the world of haute couture really see this as a world of fine art that they're supporting. Mercedes Bass went back to some of these designers over and over again, lending her support to make sure that they could keep innovating. Yes, another question.
I was listening to an NPR thing yesterday, and they said that haute couture is not fashion design. It cannot be copyrighted, but the design, a two-dimensional drawing by a designer can be protected, but three-dimensional piece cannot be, which is why it's legal, totally legal to copy, to do ready-to-wear.
Yes, the world of copyright and ownership in fashion is so complicated, and it varies country to country. It's a really complicated and often kind of confusing thing. So the idea behind fashion not being something that you can have copyright over in the US is that garments are utilitarian objects, and you can't copyright something that basically isn't elevated to the world of fine art. Interestingly, textile design can be copyrighted. So a little tension there, and sometimes people get in heated arguments about what the distinction between those two things is. But then in the world of Parisian haute couture, like that's been treated a little bit differently, specifically in France. So within the world of haute couture in Paris, basically like designs are registered with basically like the governing body for the world of haute couture, and then within that specific body, they try to kind of protect things within Paris. But the world of fashion is so extensive, it would be impossible to monitor all of that. So, going back to the Victor Costa example, it's kind of interesting to imagine where some of the boundaries with ownership and with protection might be. So, for example, people who bought Versace pieces were paying the equivalent of tens of thousands of dollars to get the haute couture piece. The Victor Costa pieces were a few $100s. Is a person buying Victor Costa ever going to buy Versace? There's a good chance probably not. So, is Victor Costa making this hurting Versace? Probably not taking money from him, right? Maybe artistically there's an issue, but financially, which is usually where a lot of these legalities kind of lie in, maybe there's not much wrong with that. And in fact, maybe Victor Costa is helping Versace because he's, creating more, popularity for this style. That's a really complicated thing. If you all want, there are some really great books about copyright law. It's a really complicated thing, and most people probably won't want to get into it. But maybe I can scan a chapter from one of them and send it to Kate, so on the chance that someone wants access to it, you all can dig a little bit deeper. Actually, fashion law is its own thing now, which is kind of exciting too. Let's see. Oh, there we go. Let's see. So thinking back to some more of these transitional figures, kind of leading haute couture houses, another beautiful example is Gianfranco Ferré, who made this incredible bodysuit. So Ferré took over as the head of the House of Dior. So Dior died in 1957. Then Yves Saint Laurent was in charge for a small amount of time. Then Marc Bowen was in charge for decades. And a lot of people kind of felt like the House of Dior was maybe getting a little sleepy, was maybe getting a little commercial. So Gianfranco Ferré was brought in as an Italian designer, the first non-French head of the House of Dior, which caused major scandal. And Gianfranco Ferré was trained as an architect. So if any of you all are fans of architecture, you can see, kind of the structural shape of this. If you look carefully, you can see the way that there are, the fabric in this is almost quilted, so there are all of these channels that run in very specific directions. You can see that they kind of fall at an angle on the sleeves and then up and down on the bodice to create the structure. It's almost like iron beams in a building to make this kind of stand away from the body. So we can see other forms of art kind of influencing fashion design in this period. Another really exciting figure in the world of fashion history, especially in the late 80s, was Patrick Kelly. So he is credited with being the first black designer to be part of the world of haute couture in Paris. You'll notice in this exhibition that there are a whole lot of white designers and a whole lot of guys, so it's kind of exciting to be able to highlight a person of color in here. Patrick Kelly is a really fascinating and fun character. So as an American designer and as an African American, he brought a lot of cultural references that kind of lay outside the world of Parisian haute couture. He was not looking to Balenciaga and looking to Dior. He was looking at the sharecroppers that he grew up around in the American South. He was looking at Las Vegas and thinking about how fun American culture can be and how pop culture, something that is not considered to be high culture or fine art, can really inspire high fashion. So this is a really fun and playful piece. Patrick Kelly is known for using buttons, a lot of novelty buttons in his piece, which you'll notice here with all of these dice that have been strategically placed kind of all over this piece. I think many of us have kind of fun experiences and memories with buttons. How many of you all have been around someone who had like a metal tin that was full of loose buttons, right? Something I think almost all of us can relate to, right? So Patrick Kelly remembered growing up and often going to his grandma to have her fix his clothes. So if a button popped off, she would reach into her tin and grab just a random one and put it on. So all of his clothes ended up being kind of like fun and playful hodgepodges because of that. Again, this is not a high culture concept, right? No one would probably say that grandma's button tin is usually associated with Parisian haute couture. So Patrick Kelly is actually doing something kind of radical here. Using these really fun buttons as, a high fashion element. You'll notice that he likes playing with motifs over and over again, kind of playing with different iterations. So on this piece, the lining of this jacket is white fabric with black dye. So when you flip it open, it's almost like the exact opposite as the blouse that's underneath. You'll notice that there are dice that are buttons, and then that there are patch pockets kind of scattered throughout the entire garment, even on the back of it, and that there are pinstriped fabric that match the color of the buttons with the pockets. So there's a lot of thought that went into this. You'll also notice that this pinstripe fabric is something that we often associate with business suits, which is something that I think, even today, maybe we're still pushing against the idea that women can be successful in the business world and that are on par with men. So using suiting fabric here is a gentle statement too, but that he's using it in a really playful way is saying, we can take these ideas seriously, but let's still remember that we can laugh once in a while. Patrick Kelly you can see that he really enjoyed people having fun in his clothing. And I think that's really why a lot of people gravitated towards him in Paris. There were a lot of really storied designers who took their craft incredibly seriously, and so did Patrick Kelly. All of his pieces are impeccably made, but he thought that you could have impeccably made clothing and still have a sense of humor at the same time. So I think he's a really important figure for us to keep in mind, especially if we think the world of high fashion is something that might be a little stiff and cold sometimes. Let's use Patrick Kelly as our inspiration to loosen up a little bit. Todd Oldham, now we're shifting to American designers primarily. Todd Oldham, I'll admit, is one of my very favorite designers. He is an incredible person, and I think his work is some of the most creative, the most creative pieces we have in our museum. Todd Oldham was also quite savvy, and that when he closed his fashion design business in 1999, he took his entire archive and dispersed it to a few different museums around the country. So we have part of it. The Rhode Island School of Design Art Museum, RISD, also has part of his collection. So we have around 150 Todd Oldham designs, most of them because he was savvy enough to save them, and because he was generous enough to donate them to us. It's because of that now almost every fashion exhibition that we curate includes at least one Todd Oldham piece. So thinking about designers kind of protecting their legacy, Todd Oldham was really smart in making sure that people who kind of control fashion history have his name at the top of their roster, right? He's a smart man. So Todd Oldham was really innovative for a number of reasons. One thing that's really fun to think about, he was not trained as a fashion designer, and he got most of his inspiration going to thrift stores and flea markets around the world, but especially in the United States. So a lot of his pieces have references that I think are really accessible to a lot of people. You'll notice the dress on the end, what looks like a belt. Can anyone identify what those actually are? They're shirt sleeves, right? So again, we're kind of mixing menswear and women's wear because this is considered like a men's dress shirt. And then in kind of a postmodern way, Todd Oldham is recontextualizing a shirt sleeve and making it into a belt. So he's kind of playing around with what forms in fashion can be. The piece in the middle, it's kind of hard to see what that pattern is, so you'll have to look at it really closely when you go to the gallery. Has anyone seen it upstairs? Do you know what it is? It's shredded paper. Yeah, which is really fun, right? So this is important for a few reasons. So Todd Oldham decided to make a textile print based on shredded paper because someone gave him a gift and it was wrapped in this multicolored shredded paper, and he thought that was so beautiful that was the gift itself. Which I think kind of tells us a little bit about how Todd Oldham views the world, that he sees everything as a possible source for inspiration. And another important moment, and this is also on the handout, digital printing on fabric was just becoming a technology that was accessible to people, that was actually refined to the point that designers could use it. So if you look at some of the prints on clothing that we have on today, or you even look at the seats that we're sitting in, there are patterns that repeat. The seats are woven. Many of the pieces that we're wearing are probably printed. They have patterns that repeat, so there's kind of like a pretty narrow set of images that get used over and over again. And if you look at a lot of what we're wearing, there's a pretty limited color palette. There aren't a lot of colors that are used for those prints. So digital printing kind of blew all of those things out of the water, in the same way that if we decided to print on a sheet of paper, we could have kind of photorealistic detail being depicted, right? We don't rely on just using 3 colors and that print repeating. So it's really an innovative thing that fashion designers had access to this technology and could make prints of whatever they wanted. Also, if we go to a fabric store, what are the chances that they're going to have fabric that has shredded paper printed on it? Right? Almost none. So this means that designers have a lot more control over what they can use for their fashion designs. So that has a lot of implications. It means that other cultural touch points can be used in the world of fashion design, kind of blowing open the doors for, again, kind of like a postmodern approach to fashion design. That high and low culture can merge, that something as humble as shredded paper can be recontextualized and kind of be elevated through its positioning in high fashion. And then the piece on the end, this is a great one to look at. This is all made out of woven ribbon. So this is not a printed textile. This is something that's physically made through weaving polyester satin ribbons. So I'm sure that's something many of us have played with before. Cheerleaders tie bows in their hair with these. A lot of children's clothing has this on because it's kind of shiny and playful and colorful. So again, these are not necessarily high fashion references, but Todd Oldham is really elevating them, developing textiles that use these really humble materials, and bringing them to the world of high fashion. One of my very, very favorite pieces by Todd Oldham is this dress, which depicts pages from Arizona Travel magazine, which is so fun, right? Like how many of us have had like stacks of magazines sitting in the corners of our houses, or been to someone's house that's like that. Today we flip through magazines, thinking about social media, we're just inundated with images all the time, right? To the point that we almost don't even look at them anymore. So what does it mean when Todd Oldham takes one page from a magazine or a few pages from magazines and reproduces them, blows them up, and puts them on someone's body? Right? It means we have to stop and actually look at this. And stopping and looking and appreciating something, especially as simple as a reproduced image, I think is kind of a radical idea. So it's really wonderful that Todd Oldham has elevated this thing. You can see that in the styling for his runway show that he brings it a step further even, almost making like a ghillie suit hat for, I think this is this Tyra Banks? I think so, wearing this ensemble. My very favorite detail for this is that this exact same style was worn by Wesley Snipes in the movie To Wong Fu, Thanks for Everything, Julie Newmar. Some people have seen this. I'm assuming not everyone has. I only watched it fairly recently. So this is a movie about 3 drag queens who decide to leave New York and go on a road trip across the United States. What is on this dress? Highways, people driving, right? So, there's a really obvious connection there. But then, of course, this has made something completely different by having this on a drag queen's body. So go Wesley Snipes for wearing Todd Oldham in this. If you watch this movie again, all of Wesley Snipes' clothing is made by Todd Oldham, so you can see some other really bonkers stuff. It's so much fun. And for what it's worth, this wasn't like a one-off statement that Todd Oldham was making, dressing someone playing a drag queen. He was one of the first designers to have drag queens walk the runway for him in New York. So, when that's probably still a radical idea in 2020, I think we can celebrate that at this exhibition at the McNay, there's a moment of really, of a moment of equality that's being championed for through clothing. I think clothing can be something that's simple that we just use to cover our bodies, but it can also be a really important political statement. Yes?
What's the name of the film?
It's called To Wong Fu. So like you're addressing something to someone, T-O, Wong, W-O-N-G, Fu, I think is F-U. Thanks for everything. And then the name Julie Newmar. So that's supposed to be kind of like an inscription that Julie Newmar made on a photograph of herself, and I think maybe gave to one of the drag queens. It's a really great movie. So the drag queens road trip across the United States, their car breaks down and they end up in this like kind of middle of nowhere town that's really isolated. And in their time there, they try to help people discover that they can be any fantastic version of themselves that they want to be. So it's not, trying to convert everyone into drag queen territory, but it's definitely trying to celebrate that each one of us are unique individuals and we should never feel like we should be anything but that. So I think it's a really uplifting message and could be a great introduction to some drag queens too. Yes?
Henry Wiley did a whole line of women. He introduced himself on the streets, coming and dressed in couture, Javinci.
So some
So he
Givenchy.
has a whole series of portraits of black women in couture.
Oh, that's fantastic. So there's an example from Kahinda Wiley, who's a really important artist, who often takes marginalized figures and celebrates them through kind of like academic style painting often, or making marble busts of them. So there's a comment that he did a series where he took maybe women off the street and dressed them in Givenchy pieces. So again, using the power of fashion to kind of show people the power that they actually have. So I'm sure through the run of this exhibition, you all will find lots of moments. Now that you are all becoming fashion historians, you will find so many moments where fashion history will just come up all the time. Another really great piece to think about, because I know the McNay's collection has quite a few textiles. These are some pieces from the company Cross Colors. Cross Colors was founded in the late 80s and ran just through the early 90s. They ended up having some financial problems because department stores started closing and some of their biggest accounts just kind of dropped off out of the middle of nowhere. But Cross Colors was formed to create a lot of streetwear clothing. So we've been talking about a lot of really high fashion that originates on runways in New York and Paris. But guess what? There are a lot of people who are not considered just fashion designers who are innovating with silhouettes and how people wear things that bring their own aesthetic and their own cultural backgrounds. So Cross Colors was formed to try to create kind of like a positivity for Black communities, especially in the US. So if you look at even their website today, because they've recently relaunched their company, you can see a lot of messaging about especially African American communities pulling together and celebrating each other, celebrating themselves. During this time, gang violence was a really big concern. So the idea of cross colors, that people from different gangs wearing different colors could come together and actually find unity and not decide to shoot each other. It's a pretty good thing, right? This company started out with the name Cross Cultures. So even thinking about people within an African American community having a lot of different cultural backgrounds, that people could come together and find a shared community was really important to them. And you can also tell that they really celebrated color with their pieces. Many of their garments use green and yellow and red and green and yellow and blue. So kind of nodding to like a Pan-African flag. This piece specifically, you can see it especially in the photo in the top corner, is representing kente cloth. Is that something that any of you all are familiar with? Like maybe you've seen like African student unions graduations that they have the stole that has like bands of patterns that are pretty similar. So kente cloth is really important kind of across Africa, but it's my understanding that it originated in Ghana, and these were woven strips of fabric that were worn basically by kings and nobility in that area. So you can see that instead of having really expensive bands of fabric that are hand created with really rich colors that were created through really exclusive dyes to create such saturated color. You know, obviously that's something that's very expensive and very special, which is why people like kings were wearing kente cloth. Here you can see that this is printed on fabric. So this is something that's kind of bringing that power to everyone. These pieces were pretty affordable and took a lot of styling notes from how people on the street and streetwear communities were dressing. So you'll also notice that these shorts, it's hard to see this when something's on a mannequin, but you can see that the legs are really, really wide and that the waistband is pretty narrow. So the way they styled these is so things would be really baggy. So we probably have an idea of people like sagging or like wearing baggy pants. And people originally just bought things that were a few sizes too big. Well, fashion designers took note of that and just made the pant legs a lot wider and then made the waistband so pants would actually stay on people's bodies. So yeah, kind of an interesting like give and take between the fashion design world and how people are choosing to take a fashion designer's idea and make it their own. Cross Colors is really having a moment right now, for what that's worth. They did recently restart their company now that they have like their name back and have some more financial backing. There's actually an exhibition up right now in Los Angeles in a museum that celebrates African American culture that's specifically about Cross Colors. So on the chance that any of you all are going to LA between now and September, you should check this out. I'm planning on seeing this in March, and maybe I can report back. I really can't wait. I think this is the first time that this design company has been celebrated in an exhibition. And honestly, most fashion museums don't have pieces from Cross Colors. Embarrassingly, our collection didn't until we started working on this project. And we actually purchased these pieces for our permanent collection because it was really important to us to not just have upper class white high fashion design represented, that the world of fashion is far more expansive than that, and we need to lend some of our power to making sure that marginalized voices are actually being celebrated. So again, I would really hope that as you all are leading people through the exhibition, you take note of which designers you're focusing on, and then maybe check and see if they're designers that maybe they're the ones you're already familiar with. And I would encourage you to push yourself and maybe try to learn about a few new ones, especially some of the designers of color that we've made sure to highlight in this project. So another really fun example, this is another piece we actually procured specifically for this exhibition, and because we wanted it for our permanent collection. This is a piece by Vivian Tam. Does anyone know who's being depicted on here? Yeah, General Mao, excellent. Cool. Yeah, that's a figure that not everyone will know when they come into the exhibition. So especially if some of you are less familiar, Mao Zedong was the leader of basically like the communist revolution in China. It has been a pretty controversial figure. It was really exciting for Vivienne Tam to highlight him through her fashion designs in 1995 because this was after Mao had passed away, and a lot of Chinese culture was kind of trying to relax around the idea of Mao. So for a long time, images of him, like this one on the bottom, were kind of celebratory and carefully controlled. Yeah, it's like, this is not necessarily how we see a lot of leaders depicted today, but there is often a very specific aesthetic in different communities and different cultures. You can see that the picture of Mao was so prevalent in culture that we even have an Andy Warhol print above this kind of playing with that. And then we can see that Vivienne Tam has kind of played with how Mao is being depicted here. And the label in the exhibition explaining what these different pictures mean is perfect. So I'm not even going to tell you what it is. You have to go up and read it. But I think it's important for us to think about what it means to have a political figure be depicted on a dress. Right, so this is a time that attitudes were kind of loosening up in China. Vivienne Tam was born in China, raised in Hong Kong, and at this point was working in New York. So she had a little bit of distance from some of this. But this is still a pretty controversial thing to do, right? Like, what if someone walked down the street with a contemporary political figure, you know, all over them and their face like almost kind of graffitied in this way? Like, that is a big statement. And Vivienne Tam has said she was not trying to be controversial with this, but I kind of wonder if she's being, you know, a little cavalier with that statement, because it did cause a lot of controversy. She worked with a Chinese American artist to make this image. So this is another really great overlap between the world of fine art and fashion. She had a really hard time finding manufacturers to actually make this, because you can imagine that might have political consequences. So that was a hurdle for her. I've read that when she sold these to retailers to then sell to the public, that sometimes those shipments were wrapped up in brown craft paper so no one would know what was in them, on the chance that they might have been stolen or maybe, you know, made off with and damaged, because not everyone was really excited about this. So I think this is a really important moment, again, of thinking about how fashion can have a whole lot of power, that it can really make a big statement. This is something that put Vivienne Tam like literally on the pages of Vogue for this collection. So I would encourage you all to look at this closely and maybe think about what something like this would mean to us today, and maybe think critically about that. Is there a question?
I just have this burning question. Mm-hmm. I'm sure all of us remember when in China, you know, during his reign or whatever, they wore the exact same clothes. Mm-hmm. Was that still the law at the time that this was made?
That's That's a great question. So the question was, during this time period, were Chinese people still wearing kind of like the communist mandated uniform? And the answer is no. That especially after Mao died, a lot of things changed and relaxed, and people had more freedom. Interestingly, some other pieces in this Vivienne Tam collection actually played with that form. So some of them were the exact same style as those Communist Party uniforms. So that's, again, kind of a pretty complicated thing to think about. Like, what would it mean for us today, for example, to see like a Marines uniform being treated as fashion, or, you know, the style of a Marines uniform being made with, you know, fashion fabric with a political leader printed on it. You know, this is a pretty provocative thing. Oh, camouflage? Yeah, camouflage is a really interesting thing to think about. The camouflage started out with a really, you know, practical military application, and there's even an Isaac Mizrahi piece in this exhibition that uses camouflage. So what does it mean to us to turn camouflage into a fashion fabric? Does that mean that we're lending to support to the armed forces, and that we want to make that a fabric that is considered part of our more general culture? Or does it mean that military culture has permeated everything in our lives to the point that we can't even escape it with the clothing that we wear? Is it a political statement when some people wear camouflage and others don't? Who's allowed to wear camouflage? You know, it's a pretty complicated thing. Yes?
I have a question. Excuse me, about the... Never mind. I don't have
Okay, well, and maybe this is a good moment to say that I'm sure through this exhibition you all might end up coming up with questions. You might have questions from the public that you're trying to field and you're just not sure. For what it's worth, I'm always here for you. I think part of the responsibility of a fashion curator that's lending pieces is to lend expertise. So with that said, I feel like there might be a way for maybe you all to collect your questions and maybe send them to Kate, and then maybe she can funnel them to me. And I only say not to send them directly to me because there's a good chance if you have a question that other people might too. So if Kate can kind of collect them, then I can make sure everyone has access to the information that I can share with you all. So yeah, with that, I'd like to say this exhibition covers a lot of territory. There are a lot of pieces in here that represent many different approaches to the world of fashion. And even though we're kind of limiting ourselves to the 1990s, I think it's really important to remember that there's diversity here that we should celebrate. So while you're going through the exhibition, I hope you think about your own relationship with some of these styles. Like you think about what fashion means as an art, but also as something that's literally on our bodies every day. And I hope that as you come up with questions through this exhibition, that you're able to do a little bit of research and able to feel like you can ask me questions. So thank you all for your time today.